So thanks for that introduction. And Martha, thank you so much for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure. In my previous life, I was running an event in New York called The Future of Storytelling. On the surface, the conference closely examined how technology was kind of impacting the media and changing the way we tell stories, but at the heart of it, we were really interested in how the relationship between author and audience was undergoing a radical transformation, which I know we talked about a little bit on that last panel here. So this is a shot of the Disney animator Glen Keane. Glen has illustrated some of the most iconic Disney characters that we know today, Beauty and the Beast, Little Mermaid. And we produced this performance with him where we introduced him to the HTC Vive, which is a room scale motion tracking system, along with Tilt Brush, the painting application that was brought up earlier today. And through the use of this technology, Glen kind of rediscovered his love and craft for drawing. And it was these kinds of experiments at Future of Storytelling that we got to dive into. So after several years of working with some of the kind of most innovative thought leaders in VR and in VR's early days, I kind of pivoted from a curatorial role into a more producerial role. I had exhibited a lot of stories and now I was kind of ready to tell them on my own. And so that brought me to Tool of North America, which is where I am today. Tool is one of the top production companies in the world. It's one of the first shops to really invest big in VR and dedicate an entire division to the medium, which I now head up today. We've worked with some of the leading brands on a number of VR experiences. We've got some demos out in the lobby you're welcome to try afterwards. These are just some of my colleagues here. Our head of digital and experiential and managing partners. It's a fun crew to be a part of. And we also represent a roster of about 25 different directors, visual artists, narrative designers, interactive designers. These are some of the storytellers that I get to work with every day on kind of crafting and creating new kinds of narrative experiences. And it's been a dream come true to kind of go on that journey with them, and it's also been quite a creative conundrum. So typically the ways in which we entertain and inform ourselves, they've been pretty passive, very broadcast style. We're spoon-fed from an abundance of media and an endless array of platforms and devices, but for the most part, stories have always followed a linear trajectory, more or less. Consider the earliest novels. If you consider it to be the tale of Genji, then authors have had the opportunity to perfect their craft since the 11th century. With art, the art of movie making, 120 years they've been at practice at that. And even with gaming, since Pong was released in 1972, they've had some time to kind of figure out how to create stories in those mediums. But in each one of these, narrative has been confined to a rectangle, more or less. And this is one of the ways that VR really distinguishes itself from other revolutions in computing technologies. It's really the departure from storytelling in this rectangle that makes it so unique. So as we step through this frame and into the sphere, there's this dramatic shift that happens in our physical relationship to the media. It's content that we're no longer watching, but now it's content that we're experiencing firsthand. So in VR, we literally become this natural extension of the creator's environment. And so therefore, our expectations on how we experience this world shift from passive to participatory. With movies and TV, you are watching the story, but you're not living it. In real life, it's our personal decisions, however, that really dictate what happens next. And this is where storytelling, as we define it today, is kind of fundamentally at odds with this medium. You want to believe that we are here, yet we don't have agency, we don't have free will. So you ask yourself, is any attempt at storytelling in VR some form of enslavement, which is a little overdramatic, but in some cases the answer might be yes, if we continue to structure story in the same fashion that we have for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So before I progress any further, I do want to call out one big distinction, and that's between virtual reality and 360 video. oftentimes VR is kind of used as a catch-all for both of these mediums. And it's understandable, they did emerge around the same time, but in essence, these are dramatically different formats. They wear the same skin, but they're really built in totally different ways. Inhabiting one is dramatically different than governing the other. So technically speaking, 360 video is pre-rendered. It's equirectangular film that's been wrapped around a sphere. The second you put that headset on, it's plug and play. There's no interactivity. VR, on the other hand, is rendered in real time. So this is 360 equirectangular film. And then this is another shot of tilt brush, but showing how VR is basically grants the user complete agency over the experience that they're having. The story becomes dictated by every behavior that they make, and they really get to choose how to interact with the world and guide that story. So what's misleading is that these radically different types of media are deployed through the same device. This is a Google Cardboard headset. And for most, the bulk of what they've experienced up to date is 360 video. Very few people have actually tried VR, which is kind of ironic. And for a nascent industry, 360 video has been crucial in raising public awareness for this new kind of spherical content. But 360 video is really only a gateway drug to VR. And once you get your fix, you're kind of left craving a little bit more. And it's been over 2 years now since Facebook acquired the VR company Oculus Rift. And I have to say, audiences are getting a little bit more discerning, and I think storytellers are starting to feel the pressure of novelty wearing off. So the question is, for creatives, what does storytelling look like when the author is forced to relinquish control of the audience, or to the audience? How do you construct a narrative when you can't predict where the user is going to look? And how do you tell a story with multiple outcomes and infinite numbers of possibilities? And these are some of the questions that we're asking ourselves right now. So if I had to boil it down to kind of 3 of the biggest challenges that we look at today, it's the following. It's loss of control, it's dealing with ideas around user identity, and it's time scale. So, of course, with great risk comes great reward, and inherent in each one of these challenges is vast creative potential. So we'll kind of dive into each one of them and see if we can find the opportunities therein. So the first we'll look at is loss of control. So traditionally, filmmakers have been kind of control freaks. Visually, they leave very little to the imagination. What you see is what you get. Their work is neatly contained to a frame, while behind the scenes, they get to hide the crew, the rigging, the lighting, all of the practical magic that makes movies the wondrous worlds that they are. So now consider spherical media, specifically live action 360 video. This is a camera that's made by a company called Jaunt. So in this instance, where do you hide the crew when everything around you is fully exposed? How do you light a scene when the audience can look up or down? And where does the director stand to coach the actors? So there is no behind the camera. With 360 video, the audience is the camera. So the second consideration to take into account is field of view. So for most of today's head-mounted displays, the typical FOV is somewhere between 90 degrees and 110 degrees. So in other words, the user is missing more than what they're taking in. They're missing roughly 75% of the story that you're trying to tell. And the challenge is you never know what 25% of that story they're going to see at any given time. So how do storytellers solve for that challenge? So at Tool, we have several kind of creative templates that we use in early stages of development that really gets us thinking about the sphere rather than the frame. And the first is something called quadrant blocking. So it's a style of script writing and also storyboarding that we use, and it really takes into account the spatial realities of this medium. So by dividing the sphere into 4 different quadrants of 90 degrees each, and then laying it out in more of a script format, you really start to force yourself to think about what's going on in every area of the sphere at any given time. And so you come up with a format like this, where on the x-axis you have the spatial areas, you have the quadrants, and then going along the y-axis, you use that for time as the story progresses. And as we learned earlier today, the importance of spatialized sound cannot be underestimated. So including not only cues for visual shifts, but also for audio shifts, what's going on in each one of these quadrants when it comes to sound. Another important thing to think about is how your characters and how the action is moving in the scene. So spherical blocking, this is an example, this is a diagram that's using a 6-camera array. You know it's 6 cameras because you have the 3 lines intersecting the circle, and each one of those segments represents 1 field of view per camera. So what that means is where each one of those lines lay, that's where we're going to have to stitch those videos together. And the more movement and dynamic visuals you have within those stitch lines, the trickier it is to get a perfect seamless stitch. So it's something you always want to remind your actors and anyone on set where those stitch lines are, and to avoid crossover as much as possible. The other limitation you have is, depending on what camera rig you're using, you can only get so close to the camera. So that orange circle is the camera or the user point of view, and then the circle beyond that represents the glitch zone. So if you get any closer to that camera, you're going to have issues around parallax and issues around parallax. So another thing to take into consideration. And then finally, this is a storyboarding template that we use. So again, taking into account the field of view. For a typical headset, it's around 90 degrees. This is assuming a seated experience. So if the user looks left or right, then about 150 degrees is a comfortable field of view. And then beyond that, about 240 degrees is the max you're going to get. So they're very unlikely to look all the way behind you or behind themselves. And then the second thing to take into account is distance and depth perception. So again, depending on the limitations of the camera, you can only get so close to it. Within 10 meters of this particular example is where you have the strongest stereoscopic depth perception. And then beyond that, at about 20 meters, that's where you start to lose depth. So if you combine field of view with these depth perception diagrams, you get something like this, which is probable areas of interest. So where the dark shaded area is, that's where your viewer is most likely going to look. The lighter shaded areas, you're going to have to guide their attention there somewhere, whether it's using a visual cue, if it's using lighting, if it's using sound. And then you can drop the user right in the center of it, and you can start thinking about environmental storytelling and what's going on around the sphere relative to that user in each one of your scenes. And then you can turn it into a template form like this. So this is one of the exercises we use to really force ourselves to think about the full spatial realities of VR. And it's also really helpful to share with clients, so they also have a good sense of what's going on in the frame, and you can answer that really important question, which is, why are we telling this story in VR and not film? So the next challenge I'll talk about is user identity. So once in a headset, one of the hurdles to overcome is this identity crisis, right? We ask ourselves, who am I and why am I here right now? And you always want to give the user time for sensory adaptation. So when you first drop them in, you want to give plenty of time for them to look around, figure out where they are, avoid any rapid cuts. All really important for clear storytelling. And so consider the nature of most digital mediums: television screens, mobile devices, laptops, all storytelling in rectangles, and they're all 2D abstractions of a 3D world. So the ways in which we have always related to media is with some kind of interface that sits between us. At no point would our conscious brains ever mistake it for being real. But in VR, this interface totally disappears, and we find ourselves in this 3-dimensional world. Our expectations kick in. Our perceptual systems, they expect to hear things, to feel things, to even smell things that we're seeing through this lens. So unlike any other medium, 360 in VR really is a metaphysical medium. So Devin Dolan of Cinetic Media put together this awesome punnett square that kind of identifies the 4 permutations of the metaphysics of 360 in VR, and they're based on the user's existence in that world and their influence over it. So you have user existence across the top, and you have their influence across the y-axis. So it's a really key decision for the storyteller to make early on as they're kind of developing and designing that narrative. What role do you want your user to have? So this first one in the corner, observant active, this means you have agency in the world, but you're not embodied. So if you look down, you don't necessarily see legs or any form of avatar. Your role is kind of godlike. You can make choices, but you're not necessarily changing the ending. So this is very much a new format for storytelling that's interesting to dig into. The next is observant passive. So this is a really traditional way of telling narratives. It's kind of documentary style. You have no existence. It's linear. It's an on-rails experience. And this is where most of today's 360 video lies today. You'll see a lot of kind of journalism and 360 docu-style experiences that lie in this quadrant. And you know, because it's the same style of story we've always been able to tell, you kind of want to ask yourself, why did we choose 360 for this? Something to consider. And then next we have participant active. So in this case, you're an embodied character in the story. You have the power to change the outcome. This is much like video games as we know them, Grand Theft Auto. And then finally, participant passive. You're given a role to play, but the format does not allow for interactivity. So you're maybe acknowledged by characters in the scene, but you're not able to respond to them in any meaningful ways. You kind of lack free will. This is also a new format for storytelling. So both of these categories really allow us to tap into some of the unique opportunities with this medium. They demonstrate that inherent in VR and 360, there's new tools in the storyteller's toolkit that are really exciting to dig into. And the ability here is to manipulate self-awareness and to manipulate ideas of body ownership and self-representation. Embodied cognition kind of falls within this realm. It's the field of research that studies how we think with our bodies. And bodily resonance is why people really refer to VR as an empathy machine. If the experience is convincing enough, then we will actually go through the process of reassociation. We can truly walk a mile in someone else's shoes. Changing your body has the power to change your mind. So where storytelling once had the power of persuasion, it's really now about re-identification. And I want to show one of the experiences that right now is my favorite. It's called Notes on Blindness. This is a companion VR piece to a documentary about a man named John Hull who decided to record an audio diary of the experience of losing sight. And so what they did is they took moments from this audio diary and they created an animated world around it. So in VR, you're literally seeing and having the experience of going blind. It's this gorgeously animated, kind of dreamlike, surreal environment. What's interesting about this experience is it's 40 minutes long. It's told in 4 chapters of 10 minutes each. And it's kind of an unprecedented amount of time for a VR experience. Right now, as we know, we're kind of in demo days. 3, 5, maybe 6 minutes is most of the content that we're seeing, but this is really one of the first forays to really push the limits of what storytelling means in this medium. So if you guys have access to a Gear VR headset, I would definitely recommend checking that out. And the last issue I want to talk about. Yeah, so you're hearing his audio diary, and it's very much like you're in his head listening to his internal dialogue. So it's almost like you become him in a way, and you also are watching as your sight dissipates and becomes worse and worse. So it's a very profoundly impacting experience that just kind of shows the power of, what happens when you can put someone in someone else's shoes. Did that answer the question? Yeah. Okay, cool.
It's astonishing that you have it's blindness in VR.
Right, it's very ironic, right? So this last issue that I'll talk about is time scale. And manipulation of time is one of the most powerful illusions of filmmaking, right? In the movies, time can be reversible, it's collapsible, it's accelerated, it becomes fixed. However, presence is the holy grail of VR, right? Convincing someone that they're actually there. And in reality, time moves at a very fixed rate. So practically speaking, sure, you can do things like time lapse and 360, but it's not how you experience real life. So time becomes this weird limitation that you have to kind of figure out rather than a device to further your story. The other conflict lies in the fact that most storytelling tends to be retrospective. People didn't sit around a campfire telling stories in the time frames in which they occurred. With VR, we're figuring out what does real-time storytelling look like? What is that experience? Or alternatively, what are ways that we can manipulate time while allowing the user to maintain their sense of presence? So one approach to this is introducing alternative modes of reality within a virtual environment. The use of some kind of container in which the passage of time feels authentic if you're inside of it, and outside of that container, it's governed by an entirely different set of metaphysical laws and temporal laws. So this is called nesting timescales, and it's layers of time that you experience simultaneously. So let me give you an example. And this is great because somebody already talked about this experience, but the car and how you can use this as a container. So this is pulled from that experience called Pearl by Google Spotlight Stories that was shown earlier. And basically, when you're positioned within the bounds of this car, your immediate surroundings become perceived as reality. Life beyond the window shield, however, is an entirely different dimension. So what you end up with in Pearl, which I won't play the film again, which is great because I don't have sound, so I can anyways. But what ends up happening in Pearl is you get all of these various moments of life of this young girl. The story, it's a coming-of-age story. It's about a young girl and her relationship to her father. Her father is a traveling musician, and the user in the headset is basically the passenger in this vehicle. And so you're watching the father in the driver's seat, and you're watching the little girl starting in the back seat. And you're watching her grow up into the point where she can actually start driving and, ends up being given the car from her father. And what's going on outside of the windows is this kind of fluctuation and this acceleration and deceleration of time. But it doesn't feel jarring because what's going on inside the car is stationary and static. Today I just wanted to talk about some of the creative challenges, and rather than thinking of them as challenges, if we can present them as opportunities, I would love to kind of push our perspective and shift what we see as a limitation to an opportunity to really kind of rediscover this next frontier of storytelling. But establishing the new language of narrative for VR, it's not merely a creative challenge. Breakthroughs will also happen as the technology evolves. And these are some of the things that I'm super excited about that we'll be seeing in 2016 and 2017. So WebVR is a headset agnostic API that allows you to basically run VR experiences from any device. It also allows you to kind of pull websites into the VR headset. Again, headset agnostic. It reduces the need for downloading for installations. I can send you a link to something and you can pull it up right there on your phone or in your email or out of your email. Compression, so this is just basically issues around what's possible on mobile phones and the quality of the rendering power becoming more powerful and being able to show more high quality experiences on devices right now where that's limited. Inside-out tracking, so right now to do room scale motion tracking, something like the HTC Vive, you need hardware on the outside that's kind of tracking you on the inside. That system has something like 70 sensors altogether. So with inside-out tracking, we can start having these physical volumetric experiences moving through virtual reality just using our smartphones and say, cameras that enable depth sensors. Which also pulls us into mixed reality when we can kind of meld the real world with that virtual world. And then all the way into light field capture, volumetric capture. This is kind of the creation of holograms when we can use photogrammetry to capture full environments and drop holograms in there that also are driven by AI and machine learning. I mean, that's where we're really becoming closer to the holodeck. That brings me to the end of my presentation, and thank you guys for listening.